How is everybody doing? And welcome back for another Strength Chat episode. Today, I have got a very special guest for you. Today, I'm joined by one of the world's foremost authorities on strength, conditioning, and energy systems, as well as the author of the best-selling book, Ultimate MMA Conditioning. Today, I'm joined by the one and only Joel Jamieson. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. It's always good to talk to someone else in the UK. As long as I can understand your accent, I'll do my best here.
Yeah, I always kind of have to think that, or maybe slow down a little bit speaking. I think sometimes having a broad Yorkshire accent doesn't always go well over podcasts. But I'll
yeah,
do
I mean, I've traveled a bit in the UK and Ireland, and half the time I'm trying to understand what they're talking about. The further out you get in the country, the harder it becomes. So you're not too bad. I got you.
Yeah. Oh, that's not bad then. I know, obviously, from just thinking about that, going from Leeds an hour up to Newcastle, accent changes again, and keep going north, and it changes again when you get to Scotland.
Yeah, exactly.
So, how are you? What have you been up to? What's been happening in your world recently?
Just up to a lot of things, honestly. I don't know how much you pay attention to what I work on these days, but I'm working a lot on the technology side. I'm trying to help coaches and everyone else out there connect the dots between the life outside the gym and their training inside the gym. So I'm building some technology around HRV and recovery and sleep and training and kind of the whole big picture. So I've been working a lot on that. Working on some new courses around those topics and some interval train stuff. So just a variety, actually.
Oh, cool. And because obviously you've mentioned there about traveling, with things sort of, borders opening and things getting a little bit more back to normal, is that going to pick up in terms of traveling and work on that side of things, or will it be a case of, when other projects are coming up?
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, it's been weird. I used to travel all the time in the spring and sometimes the summer. And obviously with everything the last couple of years, I haven't done much of that. But yeah, as things start to open back up, I just saw a conference that was down in Orlando this last weekend that a bunch of friends of mine spoke at and went to, and I was invited to go to that, but I'm not going to fly from Hawaii to anywhere right now. So I'm sticking it out here through the winter. But yeah, once spring and summer come around, I think I'll definitely be doing some more traveling, and it'll be good to get back in the gym and in person. I mean, I know there's been a lot of courses and things online, and I've done a lot of that, but it's always better if you can to be face to face and meet and talk and learn in person. And that's really what I think the industry needs to get back to, honestly.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose there's worse places that you could spend winter in Hawaii as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, compare the weather and where you're at.
Yeah, definitely.
Paradise over here.
Well, it's better weather than it was yesterday. I can actually see a little bit of sunshine coming out today, which will be good. Because one thing just on that, in terms of getting back into the gym and talking and presenting in the gym and in person. Obviously, there was the Kabuki Strength Education Week, presenting online. And I know for me, based over in the UK, it was really good event. I mean, all right, I was living on Pacific time for a week, but how did you find sort of like presenting on that? And do you think there'll be a lot more events and online events on that? Because in terms of reaching a wider audience, I thought that was really helpful. The only thing was, obviously, you can't get that flow of conversation between someone in person.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably you're going to see a lot of hybrid stuff moving forward. I mean, even the conference that just happened in Orlando had an online version. My friend Luca Hosevar runs a big live in-person event with 200 or 300 people. Also has a virtual option. So I think it'll be kind of the standard. The people that can make the travel and that want to make the travel be there in person will, and the people that don't want to fly halfway across the world or aren't able to, they can stream it virtually, or they can buy the recording. So I think we'll just kind of see more of that happening. And there's advantages obviously to both. So I think we'll probably just kind of continue to see that model moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think it was a cool concept, because, like you say, there's some seminars or conferences that you would look at, and it doesn't always fall where you can get over there, especially when it's abroad. So I thought that was a cool concept.
It is. Yeah, I'll just say real quick that I think that learning virtually is great. Like I said, it opened the doors for you to go to conferences, to learn from people you never get to learn from, and hear things you probably wouldn't get to hear. But I grew up in this field in the days of traveling everywhere and spending the weekends with people. And I remember Mel Stiff and Super Train. I slept at his house on his floor for 4 nights, and there's so much to be learned from just the in-person interactions. Honestly, I learned more going out to dinner or drinks with the presenters and other people in the conference afterwards than I ever learned during their talks. When you start getting a few coaches and presenters a little bit drunk, they start to really open up, and you can really pick their brain and learn a lot from them. So I don't think virtual learning is a substitute. I still believe in-person learning is the best you can do, but obviously scenarios and circumstances and locations make that impossible sometimes. So I think there's like I said, there's advantages to having both available. And I think if you can make it live, then that's the way to go. But if not, then virtual is certainly beneficial as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a good point, and that's part of the reason why I kept with the name Strength Chat, because it means that we can go on tangents and have it as a conversation, because even though there'll be questions that I've written down, there might be other thoughts, and I think sometimes, exactly like what you said there, when you're in a more relaxed environment having a beer, you can chat a little bit more, and those creative juices get flowing a little bit sometimes when you've had
it's just look, it's the same thing as virtual coaching. Everyone's jumping the virtual coaching bandwagon. I'm not gonna I won't say a bunch of bad things about it, but I think, if you can afford and you have the ability to have a coach working with you in person, you're going to get better results than you are working with somebody who's on the other side of the country or the world or whatever. It's better than not having a coach. It's better than kind of winging it by yourself. But, I think we've kind of gotten used to this in-person, these interactions virtually. And I personally don't like it. I think we need to get back to normal life and get back to interacting with people in a more personal basis, and I think we'll benefit from that once we can.
Yeah, definitely. I know when the gyms reopened back over in the UK, at first we could only do sessions outside before we could go into the gym, and I jumped at the chance to actually coach people outside. I mean, at first it was a bit of a pain grabbing equipment outside, but then actually one of the coaches that I work with, one of his friends actually made a flywheel machine, homemade flywheel machine. So
nice.
that was useful to use outside as well, and a lot easier to lug around compared to barbells and plates. Obviously, I did a little bit of an introduction there, but for anyone listening who might not know your background in coaching, the development throughout your career, and the people that you've worked with, just want to give a little bit of a background to yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I'll kind of give you the 60-second version of the last 20 years if I can. So I got started on the same side of the game that most coaches do, which is strength. I worked at the University of Washington, growing up interning with a guy named Bill Gillespie, who, if any of your listeners are familiar with powerlifting, the guy is just a monster. I mean, he's a lifetime drug-free lifter that's bench pressed 800 pounds. I believe he's in his mid 60s now. And the guy is just a freak of nature. He's incredibly strong, incredibly hardworking, consistent. And really, that's kind of where I learned the strength side and lifted with him. I mean, my deadlifts got stronger just lifting off his bench press for him than they probably have ever been. And that was really kind of the direction my career was going, with strength. Conditioning wasn't something I knew a whole lot about. I didn't really think about it. It was kind of the usual run some gassers at the end of a practice or training session and call it good. And that was really my view. And then 2003 or 2002, I moved over to the Seahawks for a little bit because Bill went over there. I followed him on the NFL and did kind of the same thing. And then decided I didn't want to spend my entire career jumping from team to team, which is the professional route that a lot of coaches decide to go. I just didn't want to have to be, playing musical chairs for jobs every few years. So I opened up a gym, and I was 23 years old, and just kind of by luck and happenstance, I guess, the gym I opened up was right next to an MMA facility, and not just any MMA facility, but what turned out to really be that best MMA facility in the world. So very quickly, I was training combat athletes of the highest caliber. The first guy I trained was for a fight in K1, which is, at that point in time, the highest level of kickboxing and MMA. So it was really eye-opening to me. And when I first started training them, I evaluated their strength. That's kind of what I knew how to do. And I was like, man, these guys are so weak. Like they can do like 3 pull-ups, and they can't bench press their body weight. They can't squat or deadlift or clean shit. Like they're so weak, right? So immediately I'm like, I'm going to make these guys monsters. I'm just going to get them really strong, and I'm going to look like a genius, and they're going to go kill everybody, and I'm going to be the best in the business, right? When I was young and naive. And so I started doing that, right? I started lifting them heavy and getting them stronger. And then a couple of times into this, they say, hey, why don't you come roll with me and give us a roll with you in the mat. So I went over there and proceeded to get my ass just kicked over and over again, even though I was twice as strong as them. I could lift so much more weight than them in the gym, and I could, I was just monstrously stronger than them, but I was done in 20 seconds, and they were just tapping me out over and over again and making me look stupid. And that was really kind of this, holy shit, I don't know what I'm doing moment, because I thought that making this guy stronger was going to really be the thing that was going to make them better. But the reality was I was way stronger than they were probably ever going to be. And I couldn't do anything against them. I was completely gassed out in, literally a matter of seconds, and they were just playing with me. So, I basically just made the decision I was never going to let them down. And I had to learn everything I could about conditioning and energy systems and help them become better athletes. Because the one thing about combat sports, it's one-on-one, right? It's not a team sport where your work might be hidden and you can't really tell what happened, right? It's your guy versus their guy or that guy. And if your guy gasses out, you don't have to look too far to figure out where the problem was, right? It was just conditioning. So, I really just dove headfirst into the conditioning side of things. And back then, you're talking 04, 05, there wasn't a whole lot out there. So it was really just a process of self-education and trial and error and training with them. I started training the sport myself so I could understand the demands of it, and doing really as much of the program with them as I could. And, eventually started having a lot of success. So I started writing about it in 2009 and opened to create my website, because I realized there was a big growth of the sport and not a lot of people talking about how to train them intelligently. A lot of it was just, smash your head in the wall over and over again and you're going to be conditioned, which was about the extent of the knowledge out there. So wrote a book, Ultimate MMA Conditioning, caught on pretty quickly, was being used by a wide array of sports. And really things just kind of grew from there. So I grew into a certification and traveling and consulting. At the same time, kind of tangential to the whole thing, I started using a technology called HRV pretty early in my career, 2002, 2001, really, really long time ago. And that was really instrumental in me understanding the demands of the sport, because I could see their recovery or lack thereof, depending on what they were doing. I could see it change as they were getting ready for fights. I could just kind of understand what was happening inside and outside the gym, and use that for a number of years. So I started developing that side of my business and my coaching in 2011. I launched an HRV app called Bioforce HRV. So it's really just been a combination of helping people understand conditioning, energy systems, preparation for sports and events. And then along the way, technology became a big part of that, and helping people understand how to, use technology for something more than just a number to look at on a screen, and helping them put all those pieces together. So it's just been a long, like I said, 20 years of learning how to do this myself, and then helping other people understand how to do it as well.
Oh, cool. I think a common word that you used throughout there was, understanding yourself, but then also passing that information on to other people.
Yep.
Because I think that's how you learn. We talk a lot about, what makes a successful strength and conditioning coach working with the sport, and especially, grappling or wrestling with the athletes that you're working with. You get more of an understanding, whereas exactly like what you say, it's a case of, they're really weak. Let's make them stronger, and they'll be able to their performance be able to benefit. It's a little bit like, we need to get them powerful, so we'll do weightlifting. Well, we don't want to make them weightlifters. They're combat sport athletes. We want to make them specific for their sport. And a couple of things sort of building off from that would be, in terms of the strength training side of things. Obviously, in terms of the barbell and the strength in the gym compared to the strength that they would have in terms of body weight and in terms of grappling, is there a difference between that, and how do you balance that? And then in terms of the fitness side of things, what are sort of the energy systems or the training that you would use to have a look and be like, right, okay, what do we actually need to work on with this athlete? It's not just a case of thinking of that the Rocky film where he just goes out running for miles and miles. What's the process of finding out what's going to work best for the athletes, if those two questions make sense?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, I think first of all, the most important thing, if you're going to work with an athlete, is to understand very clearly what the demands of their sport are, right? What are the strength demands? What are the, metabolic energy system demands? What are the competitive demands? What does their sport require? And then from there, you start to build this model, and this model really informs your coaching. And so early on, I started to realize, like, there was a certain level of base foundational, we can call it barbell strength, that they needed. If they didn't have that, then they were going to be susceptible in the grappling game, because grappling is more resistance based, the wrestling piece, you do need a fair amount of strength to be able to compete in that game, but going above a certain amount really was not more beneficial, right? Like making someone squat 500 pounds probably wasn't going to make them any better than squatting, I don't know, 250, 300 or whatever. There's disappointing diminishing returns. By the same token, there's a certain amount of aerobic development that becomes really beneficial. And once you go above that, you probably have to put so much more training into it that it takes away from their strength. So you essentially just have to realize fundamentally life and the body and performance is a game of trade-offs, right? Like you can't have it all. I can't take somebody and give him powerlifting strength and endurance athlete level endurance, and then combine this in this combat athlete who knocks you out but can do it for 5 straight rounds. Like it doesn't work that way. I can't take Usain Bolt speed and then make him run a marathon, right? It's just the body is designed to adapt to very specific demands, and it gets really good at those demands, and that means compromising other areas. So the number one thing, like I said, if you don't truly understand the demands of the sport, and that could be everything from the movement and the skills they require. So where they need strength and where do they not necessarily need strength, how many hours a day they're training. And that's the other thing you have to talk about is the training for the sport has a different requirement often than the sport and the competition itself. So like, for example, a combat athlete, they're going to fight, 3 5-minute rounds in most sports in MMA, or they're going to fight 5 5-minute rounds. So 15 or 25 minutes, that's what they're trained to fight. That's their competition. But their training every day is 2 to 3, sometimes 4 hours, right? Like their actual training has a different demand than their competition. And that's the case in a lot of sports, right? A powerlifter is probably doing 3 max reps, maybe 4, depending on the meet and they're in the lift. But the number of reps they do in training is massively higher than 3 or 4. So you have to kind of take a step back and you have to train for the training. You have to be able to have the fitness to train for the sport. And then you have to be able to transfer that into the competition itself. So I guess my long-winded answer is I always start by really understanding as much as I possibly can, what are the demands of the sport, not just the competition, but the entire process of getting ready for the competition. And from there, I start to build a model, like I said, of what separates successful athletes from from the ones who aren't. And my role as the strength and conditioning coach is to help them get closer to that physical model of what it's going to take to be successful. And that, again, a lot of times comes down to figuring out what's going to help this person get better. If this person's strength is already high enough, do I really want to spend a whole lot of resources and energy developing more strength? Probably not. If it's not necessary, I want to just maintain it. It's always trying to figure out where someone's greatest improvements are going to come from, and then steering their training around that. And just over time, you get better and better at recognizing that. You get better and better at coaching that, and you have a greater understanding of the sport. So it's really hard, I think, in this field to be a strength and conditioning coach that works with 20 different sports. That's really hard because it's very hard to truly understand the nature of each of those sports. If you can really kind of, I guess specialization is maybe not the word, but if you can get really good and be fortunate enough to work with a smaller number of sports and be really, really well informed and really, really experienced in those sports, you're going to have a much better chance of making those athletes successful than if you're trying to do too many things across too many sports you don't really understand. That's kind of the challenge of our game.
Yeah, I think it's that phrase comes to mind. Jack of all trades, maybe master of none, because then it's just sort of general strength and conditioning, if you like. We can generally get them stronger, generally get them more powerful or fitter. And a couple of things that you mentioned there in terms of understanding the demand of the sport, but then also in terms of the athlete that's in front of you. And what came to mind that when you were speaking about there, I'm not sure whether you watched the heavyweight UFC fight, Ngannou versus, I can't think of the French guy's name.
Yep, I did actually.
But both really powerful athletes. I mean, Ngannou, I think, has knocked out anyone that he's been in the ring with. So to go from being like what you mentioned there about the competition side of things, there would be 3 or 5 rounds, and he's obviously been knocking, and Ngannou's been knocking people out, whereas then he's come up against a similar athlete, a similar combat athlete, and they've gone the full distance. How do you cater that to the athlete, especially when a lot of combat athletes will have a lot of power? There'll be a lot of athletes that just want to knock people out. How do you manage their energy systems, or try and change it fight to fight, or in boxing as well, because you do find sometimes that they have to adapt to that, and sometimes they can end up blowing themselves out even though they've put the work in training.
Yeah, I mean, I was really fortunate to work with a guy named Matt Hume, who I would say unquestionably, knowing what I know, is the best MMA coach really to ever live, if not one of the best combat sports coaches to ever live. So I was able to watch his expertise, in action, because he would basically come up with a game plan for every single fight, based on the fighter, based on the opponent. And that game plan would be, what dictated what I wanted to do. If the game plan was to keep the fight standing, and we knew there was going to be a lot of wrestling to make that happen, then that requires a different training approach. And if the game plan is to take the guy down over and over again, you have to understand what is it your athlete needs to do in a competition. And then you have to give them the physical tools to do that. So, in combat sports, it's a dynamic sport. Anything can happen, obviously, and you have to be well-rounded enough to be able to perform that way. But you also want to impose your game plan on the other person. And that's a good example of it, right? You saw him actually taking the guy down to kind of throw him off, and it worked. So you basically have to be fortunate enough to have a good relationship with the skill coach, or as best you can. And I think that's something that's missing in our sport in a lot of areas outside of teams, and work together as much as you can, because your ability to help the athlete be prepared physically and mentally is dependent on what the athlete has to do. And in a sport like MMA, that is going to change, or boxing, that is going to change from fight to fight, more from MMA than boxing, because you have takedowns and whole other dimension in MMA that you don't have in boxing. But still, you kind of have to understand what are the physical things that this person has to do really well, and then how can I help them achieve those? How can I help them be able to do those in the ring, the octagon, or wherever? So, like I said, a lot of that was just fight specific, and that's what training camps are for. It's to drill over and over again, and to train the specific areas that are going to be involved in the fight. So if there's going to be a lot of Muay Thai, there's going to be a lot of clinch work, you better work on strength and neck and the posterior chain. If it's going to be a war of takedowns, and you better get them really strong in the hips and able to grapple effectively through the movements they're going to be in the game. So the more, again, that's where it comes down to the sport. You have to know the sport to be a really effective coach. And I'm not saying if you don't know the sport, you can't help them, but the more you understand the coach, or more you understand the sport, the skills, the demands, the game plan, the more effective you can be as a strength conditioning coach.
Yeah, and especially working with the skill coaches and the other coaches surrounding that athlete, because ultimately it's their performance in the octagon on fight night that's going to dictate success or failure, or what actually has happened in the gym. Not necessarily going back to the point that you mentioned about the squat. Is it really worth them pushing their squat up when actually they've got a reasonable amount of strength, and they're then strong enough to be able to put that game plan in place when it comes to fighting on the night. A couple of things from that, because obviously you mentioned at the start, understanding the sport, getting used to implementing strategies in place. What was sort of the challenges or obstacles you found with the trial and error in terms of working with athletes? Because even though we've spoken there about we can put the right systems in place, if there's going to be a lot of takedowns, we can work on those things. But what challenges and obstacles did you find, and where do you sometimes see that people go wrong in terms of preparing athletes for the game plan to put in place?
Yeah, look, I mean, a lot of it in combat sports comes down to travel is a big deal, and then weigh-ins are a big deal. When you add all that onto just the mental preparation that goes into fighting, you have a lot of room for error. So if you don't cut weight right, or if you don't travel at the right time and adjust physiologically to new time zones, all those things can have a big impact. So again, I think a lot of my early days was thinking purely about the time in the gym, and not realizing that my job didn't end when they got to the competitive city or venue. There was a lot more that had to be done. So there was again, just relying on some experience of Matt and trying some things out in terms of cutting weight and rehydrating, how much training you do on the day of the fight versus just resting. I mean, there's a lot of things you got to try to figure out. And so I think early on, we definitely made some mistakes in that area, or I did, but the more you do it, the more you become good at it, and the more you learn how each person reacts. I guess that's the other thing you learn over time is there's trial and error of each athlete. Each athlete has differences, and some are going to respond really well to one type of training and fight prep, and you get in the ring and they perform well. And then you try the same strategy with somebody else and they just fall flat. They're just a different human being. So that's the other thing about this. It's difficult. Is people are different. We're interesting people or interesting organisms, and that no two are the exact same. They're not going to respond the same thing over and over again. So a lot of, like I said, trial and error is learning the sport and then learning the athlete and trying not to screw it up as you go.
Yeah, definitely. And when you mentioned there, we've touched a little bit on the recovery side of things, and especially on traveling. And in terms of the balance between, because obviously, the work that you've done and the information on the training and the energy systems side of things, the recovery side of things is equally as important, in terms of the heart rate variability as well. What sort of the balance between that? Because I know sometimes you can get sucked into, this is going to be the plan, this is going to be the training that we're going to do. But if they can't recover from that, then they're not going to be able to get the benefit out of that training, because they're not going to be able to put as much effort in, and they might be goosed or a little bit overcooked heading into the fight. So how was that changed for you over time, and has that balance shifted? Do you sometimes more towards the recovery side of things, depending on the athlete, or is it an even split?
Yeah, I mean, there's an old saying, like, everyone has a plan to get punched in the face, right? It's kind of the same thing. Like, everyone has a great train program until you actually start doing it. So, again, as I progressed throughout my career and as I was able to work with Matt, there's a lot of variability in it. There's a lot of just coaching that goes into making decisions about, is this the right thing to do today? And he and I would both have a broad outline of what we wanted to do and what the weekly structure looked like. There's a lot of variability in that. And that's where, using HRV, just using your coaching experience, understanding that particular athlete you're working with, all that goes into decision making. So that you might come in on a Friday and you had a really intense session planned, but you just see it in their faces and you see it in the data, that's not the best plan for day. And so you make that change. I think you can't be afraid to make a change as necessary. I mean, people are dynamic and people have lives outside the gym, and those all impact everything. So the biggest thing you want to avoid is this accumulation of stress over time. So you're not going to overtrain from, a couple of days or even a week of doing more than you can recover from. But it's the accumulation of gradually doing more than you can recover from adds up. And you get what I call like a recovery debt, where you've outstripped your ability to recover for enough time that has a real impact on you, and it slows down everything and makes you more likely to get injured. It makes you more likely to just perform poorly, everything else that goes along with that. So that's what you're always looking for, right? It's making the right decision today to prepare you for tomorrow over and over again. So the more I've been in this game, the more I recognize the value of coaching in terms of making those decisions. And, that's what I think separates the really good coaches from the less experienced or less effective coaches, is knowing what the person needs on a given day. And if you watch any team, any sport, the highest level coaches, I've never seen somebody I'd consider a great coach who does everything set in stone. They're always flexible because they've learned over the years and then through the game that, you have to be adaptable to where athletes and people are, rather than where you want them to be or think they should be. You just have to meet them where they're at. So, I think that's kind of the lost part of coaching one of them is again, it's decision making. And the more you can understand the athlete and the more you can be flexible in your decision making, chances are your success rate will be much better than if you try to just keep everything set in stone and follow something that you planned out 3 months ago, because that's just not the way the real world of human beings works most of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good point, because especially if you've done a 3-month plan, a lot might change. You might get thrown a curveball. It's got to be adaptable, like what you mentioned. And I think, I always like to explain it as, right, if this is plan A, what's plan B? And then even if we have to go all the way to plan Z, at least then we can adjust and change. And there's we're still aiming to have some direction from there, rather than having it as a case of, well, this is what I planned, we've got to do this today. Well, I can't do that. Well, what's the alternative?
Yep.
In terms of the when you've said there in terms of it, adjusting the plan, and especially with the combat athletes, side of things, there can be a mentality of because, like what you said at the start, it's one-on-one, and they'll want a challenge, and they will be competitive, and there's kind of some of the maybe old school mentality in the combat sport world. how do you balance that in terms of the coaching with the systems that you've in place to maybe, I think maybe hold them back a little bit in terms of doing too much, or thinking that all they have to do is, because obviously they need to do the skill side of things, but then also there's the other element of, right, we want to do the conditioning to complement that skill set. How do you kind of get that buy-in, or was there any struggles with that to adjust and adapt that?
Yeah, I mean, that is really what relationship building is all about. I mean, you need that athlete to trust you, and you need to trust that athlete. And that, again, that kind of comes over time with working with somebody, but also comes from just success, right? I mean, I've been fortunate enough to have a lot of success and train a lot of people at the highest levels. So obviously a new person is going to come to me and trust me because I've been there and I've done that. And that just takes time to build. If you're working brand new sport and you're just kind of getting started, the biggest thing you can do is just communicate as effectively as possible why you are doing the things that you're doing, and make sure they understand, what your reasoning is. And then again, you start to get that buy-in, you start to have that trust, they listen to you and they start to be successful, and that relationship grows from there. So, I think a lot of coaches are, again, I've seen too many coaches afraid to give athletes what the coach thinks they need, rather they want to give them what they want. And that's a mistake, right? The athletes, they're competitive human beings, right? They want to perform. They think they can do more than they can half the damn time. And they're going to try to push their bodies because they think that's the right answer. And maybe in the short run they can get away with that, but your job as a coach is often not to look at tomorrow or the next day, but their career and the long term for them. So a lot of times, like I said, I think it just comes down to being a really effective communicator, explaining why you're doing what you're doing, what the benefits are, how it's going to help them. And then you just get gradual buy-in over time. You show them wins, you show that they're feeling better. You see that they start to see that they aren't, maybe they're not having the injuries that they used to have in the past, and their body is holding up to training more effectively. And they start to put the two and two together, and then they just, they get more buy-in, they listen to you more. But again, that just comes down to coaching. If you're a good coach, if you're an effective communicator, if you're able to get that buy-in, that respect and that trust, you're going to be successful, and if you don't, then you're going to be facing uphill battle with everybody you coach.
Yeah, there was a couple of things that you mentioned there, all on the side of the coaching side of things. I know we've mentioned about the training side of things and the systems that you would put in place, but all that can go out of the window if, like what you said there, trust and building a relationship with the athlete, especially for a lot of coaches listening who might be new coaches. It's a case of you need to get that sorted first. The education side of things, you can always, like what we were chatting about at the start, you can always learn those things and learn how to implement it. But if you can't put that message across to the athlete, you're always going to be struggling with that, which is an important side of things, and especially working with the athlete side of things. It's not a case of, I thought that was a really good point in terms of, we don't just want to think for the next week for the game. You've got or the fight. There's the career to think of, because as soon as you mention that, you've got to start thinking about, there's been great team sport players, great fighters who have only had a couple of fights, but then are injured or out for a long time, and then They're never seen the same athlete when they've come back because they've had injuries, whereas some of the greats of any sport have played or fought consistently and have had long, successful careers.
I would say every great just about of the sports that we think of, right? From Michael Jordan to, Tom Brady, who just retired. I mean, all the greats that we can look back on as the best of all time had long, successful careers. I mean, we don't talk about anybody that flamed out in 3 years. Right. Like you're talking about the guys who did it day in and day out for a year in and year out, with, like I said, Tom Brady being the most recent one. And the way they did it was by thinking towards the long term, and it was by taking care of their body, and it was about making decisions that weren't going to be short-sighted, and they were able to be successful because of that. So again, I think really it just comes down to having that mindset that making decisions today isn't just about today. These decisions today really are about the long term as well, and more than just about today's workout. I see this is also a big thing, I think, in personal training. It's something that, I try to get out there. A lot of coaches these days are almost afraid to train people less than 100% because they feel like they're going to leave. My clients are going to leave me if I don't give them a really hard workout, because that's what they expect and that's what they want. And, if I don't push them into the ground, then they're not going to think that the workout was good enough for them. And the biggest reality is, like, they want to get better. They want to lose weight. They want to feel better. They want to feel healthy. Like, they're there to get results, and if they think that just smashing themselves into the ground is the way to do that, they're not going to be successful. So it's up to you as the coach to educate them and to have a system behind your training, rather than just hey, I'm going to push you into the ground every single day. I mean, everybody can do that. That's the problem. If that's your mindset, you're competing with every idiot out there. Anybody can push somebody really hard and run them into the ground, but not everybody can make them better. So I think you can't be afraid to go against the grain a bit and focus on just producing results. And that comes from an intelligent training program, not just from driving people as hard as you can every time they step in the door. If your only tool in your coaching belt is intensity, you're pretty one-dimensional, unfortunately, and you're just not going to have a long career in this either, because you're going to burn through people, and ultimately you're not going to build a successful career in this sport or in this game.
Yeah, 100%. And I think I was listening to a podcast a couple of days ago, and I can't remember who was speaking, but they said you don't have to do as much as what you think you have to do. You don't have to, just absolutely push it to the limit every time. And the analogy is, if you've got your car and you just absolutely tear your car all the time and push it to the limit all the time, you're probably going to have to, get a new car relatively soon. Whereas if, like with anything, if you look after anything, make sure you get it serviced, it's MOT. Using the car analogy, it's going to last, a little bit longer. Get a few more miles in, and I think that, especially when we've spoken about the training side of things for everything that we've chatted about. That is important to remember, because if they're like what we touched on with in terms of the longer career, sometimes you have injuries. I was watching some rugby last weekend, and you could see the player had a long-term injury, and you could just see in his game he wasn't basically what it was. You could see he was frightened to step off one foot, so all the defense did was push him onto his other foot. And then that dictated the game of play, and then that impacts the performance, which goes back to what we were talking about at the start, which is it's that end result performance that we want to be focusing on. So the things in the background, we want to make sure that they're capable of that performance, and nothing sort of holding them back. Moving sort of sideways a little bit on there from the combat side of things, obviously as strength chat, talking about strength training or strength sports, and the systems and the training that we've spoken about for the conditioning side of things, and at the start knowing the demands of the sport. Do you think other sports looking at the content there, oh well, that just gets them fitter, so I can do that for my sport, and in terms of obviously in the powerlifting or strongman or weightlifting, their goal is to get stronger. So what's the level of fitness, and do you think them using these systems that are specific for combat sports, they're actually hindering their progress, rather than thinking about, right, actually what do they actually need to make them more successful in their own sport?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think anytime you're trying to copy another sport, you're probably doing something wrong. I mean, your sport is your sport. The demands are your demands. I mean, a strengthened athlete who needs to do, a power lifter, like a strongman, they've got a much different set of requirements than someone who's fighting for 15 to 25 minutes. So I wouldn't use the same conditioning methods. I wouldn't use the same training modalities. For the most part, I'm going to figure out what works best for that particular sport. So again, it comes down to what I said earlier. It's about understanding the profile, right? A powerlifter needs enough aerobic fitness to not die and to recover fast enough. And they don't need more than that, right? You don't spend so much time developing the aerobic side that you take away from the strength and power. But at the same point in time, if you do no aerobic work whatsoever, A, you're going to be unhealthy, and B, you're probably going to slow down your recovery because you're not doing anything when you're not training. So you need blood flow. You need to drive some tissue movement and mobility to drive recovery. So GPP is what powerlifters call conditioning, right? They need some GPP, but they call it something different because they hate that word of aerobic work or conditioning. They call it GPP. It's the same thing. It's just different terminology. So yeah, the question is always how much. Again, that kind of depends on the athlete. The strongman is going to need more different amounts of fitness than an Olympic weightlifter. So each sport again is a little bit different, but you have to approach strength sports very differently than a sport where your primary energy system is the aerobic side predominantly versus almost entirely anaerobic sports, which would be the Olympic weightlifts and powerlifting. So Yeah, like I said, the long answer again is just understand the profile of a successful powerlifter and work towards that, basically.
Yeah, the start that you mentioned there, if you're copying conditioning for other sports, it's a little bit like when you mentioned about, getting good at training athletes in one sport rather than being, quite general, because then you might think, oh, well, yeah, we'll just do this conditioning, it'll just help from there. And when we touched on about the recovery side of things, if you're lifting 3-4 times a week and then trying to put in, conditioning sessions that aren't specific for you, the main thing that you said there, they don't want to die. So what's the level of fitness? What's the entry point of what we want to what we want to aim for? On the flip side of that, just on the strongman side of things, because especially with especially over here in the UK, with strongman being shown over Christmas, and it growing as a sport. When you mentioned about, the combat athletes not having to go to a maximum, what we're going to aim for around a lower weight, is that similar to then with, or what are your thoughts on the strongman side of things? Because they never actually go to maximum. It's always carrying events or anything from there. So how do you balance sort of the energy systems working for that, as well as balancing to maintain the level of strength that they've got?
Yeah, I mean, it's really the same thing. So it's a game of trade-offs, right? Like it's the same rule. Like there's a certain amount of maximum strength that a the strongman has to get to. It's obviously much higher than combat athlete, but most of the best strongmen are not world record holders in the major powerlifting events. Although some are, there are certainly some strength athletes who come from that powerlifting background and they have to develop endurance. And then you have guys that now have evolved purely into the strongman from the start. So I worked with a guy named Patrick Castelli. He was one of my employees for a long time and ended up winning the lightweight strongman at the Arnold's, I think a couple of years. So I was involved in his training for quite a bit. And a lot of it is like what I said, it's understanding where that individual athlete is really, really good. And maybe some are really, really strong, where their endurance is lacking, their strength endurance. And then other guys, their strength endurance is solid, but they just don't do as well in the strength event. So again, that's where that sport is a unique challenge, because again, these are trade-offs that have to be made, and there are priorities that have to be made. And then also it's event specific. So it's the carries versus the grip based events, and each event has its own strength requirements, its own movement patterns you have to get good at, and your own skill set that you have to develop. So it is a skill sport on top of being a strength endurance sport. So it's like I said, it's like anything else. You just have to understand what the requirements are and figure out where someone's really, really good and where someone's lacking. And again, I think people just have to understand. I like to think of it like this: like you have a finite amount of energy you can use to adapt to training. It's like I have X dollars to spend every month because I can only make so many dollars, and you need to be smart about where you're going to spend that capital. It's the same thing. I can spend my money getting higher levels of maximum strength, or I can spend my money developing strength endurance, or I can invest in just one particular lift that I really suck at. So you just have to recognize, especially at the higher you go up the ladder, the more limited your ability to adapt becomes, because it takes so much more focus on one area to improve just incrementally. And so a lot of it really is just figuring out, okay, what do we really have to improve here to make this athlete better? And now at the bottom of the level, sure, I can train everything. It's all going to improve because the person sucks to begin with. But when you're talking about an athlete who's trying to win the Arnold or trying to win a world championship, very small differences can be the difference between winning and losing. So you might have to spend 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks just working on the carry events, because that's where they're really bad at, right? So, or the deadlift type events. You got to figure out, where am I going to invest my training resources to make this athlete better? And like I said, the reason strongman's fun to watch, and it's a fascinating one, is because you do have the demand for a lot of max strength, but also that has to be maintained for much longer than a powerlifter or Olympic weightlifter would. So that's why, again, it's a challenging sport. You can't go too far in any direction. You have to be really versatile in that high level strength endurance range.
Yeah, definitely. I think there was a couple of points in there, especially in the terms of, where you're going to spend that energy, or, using the analogy of spending the money. And it's the same thought I always like to use, that think of what buckets are full. Right now, we can't fill that bucket as much. So we need to focus on the other area. Obviously, we've chatted about the combat sports and the strength sports side of things. And one question that I wanted to, chat about on your thoughts is, I know in powerlifting and strongman, athletes have come from other sports, weightlifting as well. So obviously the main example is, Emily Campbell for Great Britain winning a medal at the Olympics, coming back from an athletics background. Do you think, or what are your thoughts on athletes coming from, more generic athletic fields, and they've got that base, getting involved in more specific sports such as the combat sports and the strength sports? Do you think that because they've had that grounding, because they've had that conditioning base, that it's a case of once they get the skill of the other specific sport, they could actually progress a little bit more from an athlete's point of view? Or what have you seen?
Yeah, it depends on the athlete, right? I mean, I will say, so combat athletes is a really good example because MMA hasn't existed for that long, right? I would say arguably the 90s back in Japan, you had pankration, you had some of the early kind of MMA type sports. But in the early days of MMA, everybody came from a different background. You had wrestlers coming in, you had boxers coming in, you had the BJJ guys coming in, right? And they all learned the other side of the game, and they tried to get better at, if they were a grappler, they try to get better at boxing, or if they were a wrestler, they try to get better at submissions. And they evolved by trying to add these different elements to their game. But over time, the people that grew up in that sport of MMA and just, they weren't a boxer to begin with, they were just an MMA athlete, they ended up winning. I mean, they ended up being much more dominant. They pushed the sport forward tremendously. So I think if you can train one particular sport from the youngest ages all the way up, of course, you're going to be ahead of somebody who spent multiple years training an entirely different sport. Now, obviously, some sports transfer over better than others. I mean, somebody who's got a background in powerlifting is probably going to be better than somebody who is a professional hockey player going to strongman because there's a more direct transfer. But you definitely face an uphill battle if you're only in the sport for 2 or 3 years competing with somebody who's been in the sport for 20. And I think the more a sport evolves, the more that just becomes the norm. And the longer a sport is around and the more people are in the sport, the harder it becomes to be competitive if you didn't start out at a young age. I mean, let's look at the sports that have been around longer, track and field and figure skating and all these events where, like, I was just watching the Olympics, and there's a Russian, she's 15, and they're saying she's one of the greatest skaters of all time at this point. She landed the first quad jumps. She's been doing that since she could probably walk. Is somebody who played soccer until they were 12 going to compete with that? Obviously not. You have to, at the highest levels of sports that are very, very evolved like that, you kind of have to start out in that sport because you just can't develop the skills that are necessary to do that at the highest levels. But I think strength sports are still, kind of side sports to begin with. There's not a lot of people trained strongman from the age of 5 or 10 or 15. Like, that's not really where most people start out, right? They start in other strength sports, so you're kind of in a level playing field. But I think probably, as time moves on and sports evolve and there's more money in the sport, you'll see more and more people gravitating towards that. I mean, when I was first getting into combat sports, you didn't have people training combat sports in high school or middle school, and now you do, because UFC has been around a long time and there's money in it. If there was $10 million contracts in strongman, I can guarantee you'd see a lot more people competing in strongman in their much younger years, and you would see the development of the sport would be pushed just naturally by people gravitating towards it. So it's just it's about the evolution of the sport. So I think it just depends.
Yeah, definitely. Quite a lot of topics covered there, Joel, and a few tangents thrown in there as well. But the last question that I like to ask from everything that we've chatted about there, for everyone listening, what would be your take-home points or words of wisdom from everything that we've chatted about there?
Yeah, look, I think the biggest thing I would say is focus on consistency above all else. I think too many people get wrapped up in the intensity of the equation. How much can I lift? How hard can I go? Et cetera, et cetera. And that's never really the long answer to the question of what should I do today? Think about what you should be doing tomorrow and the next day and the next day when you make a decision about what you're going to do today, because that's what drives home consistency. I think if there's one secret to success, I would say it's find the way to be consistent in everything that you do, and you'll be successful. It's the people who are constantly trying to chase the how hard can I go and how much can I do today, that are the ones that fall prey to these short-term, gains and long-term pains, because they just aren't able to sustain that. So, like I said, one thing is just focus on consistency above all else, and chances are you're going to be successful. If you forget about that and you chase the everyday, how hard can I go, you're going to have an uphill battle.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to finish on. And I think sometimes everyone's looking for the new answer or something a little bit more crazy, whereas actually, you know, consistency is going to, like what we spoke about, you know, in terms of the greats of any sport, they've had that consistency. They've been able to play week in, week out. They've been able to have, you know, regular fights and have and stay consistent with that, which is, you know, exactly what we're aiming for. Thanks a lot, Joel, for taking the time to jump on. Really, really appreciate you taking the time to chat. From everything that we've chatted about there, if anyone's got any questions about what we've chatted about today, or see the content or the products that you put out there, where could people find you or reach out to you?
Sure. Just 8 weeks out, number 8, and weeksout.com. There's a contact form through there. You can find me Instagram, just /coach Joel Jamieson on there. And between the old IG and website, you can find pretty much everything I've put out at one point or another.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Joel, for taking the time to jump on. Like I say, really, really enjoyed chatting with you today. Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.